All right, we are recording. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Maddie, who is our awesome statewide entomologist and IPM faculty specialist here at HGIC. And we are super excited to have you here today to talk to us about moths, Maddie.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And to echo what Steph said, thank you for spending your lunchtime with us, especially it is a beautiful day here in Central Maryland. So I hope you're getting some sunshine today. Happy National Pollinator Week. I'm glad you all are interested in learning about Maryland's moths and just moths overall, because they are a very cool group of insects. So today we're going to be talking moth-friendly Maryland, the vital roles of moths and how to support them. So as I'm with the University of Maryland Extension, we have our assurance and non-discrimination statement that can be seen on the screen here. If you ever feel that a program isn't accessible to you in any way, there are contacts that are listed here on these two and Justice for All posters. If you have any questions about this, you can reach out to us or contact on the poster, as I mentioned, or people with the University of Maryland Extension. So for 2026, our National Pollinator Week is this week, June 22nd through the 28th. If this is your first time celebrating National Pollinator Week, welcome. Or if you are a veteran who's been celebrating it for the past couple of years or many years, welcome back. It's an exciting time to get people excited about pollinators. And as I'll mention toward the end of today's presentation, there is something to look forward to because there is a National Moth Week as well. So the fun continues into July as we approach that week. But National Pollinator Week was started by the Pollinator Partnership Organization. They have their own wonderful website, pollinators.org, that has a lot of really great resources and materials for you to check out if you haven't already. So here's a little outline of what we will walk through today and what I hope for you all to get out of today's webinar. And the first of which is to explore Maryland's moth diversity. We're going to be going through some key groups. So this could be relevant outside of the state of Maryland, but I really wanted to focus in on our home state here. We're going to discover the roles moth plays within our ecosystems, even beyond the role of pollination. We're going to learn ways to support moth habitat, whether that be in our own green spaces or if we're working in community gardens or demonstration gardens and such. We'll explore how to observe moths and contribute data, such as snapping photos and participating in different participatory science platforms like iNaturalist. And then last but not least, we're going to consider ways to inspire curiosity and care for moths and others. I know a lot of us were master gardeners, right? We are science communicators. So we are out there doing the outreach. We're talking about pollinators already likely. So how can we especially highlight some roles that moths play and get people interested in them? Because a lot of people are already interested in our butterflies, but our closely related moths deserve that attention too. So before we jump into our outline here, I'm going to launch a poll within Zoom. It's going to be 2 questions to get us started here. Pull that up now. So if for any reason you're having technical issues and you cannot see the poll, you can't respond to the poll, I'll go ahead and read aloud the 2 main questions, and you're welcome to put your thoughts in the chat box. The first question is, when you hear the word moth, what comes to mind first? And then the second question is, how often do you notice moths outside? And as a heads up, we're going to have several of these polls throughout today's presentation to keep things engaging and to get some input from you all. I'll also be showing a lot of the poll results. Your responses are anonymous, but I figure we could learn something, see something from the audience in terms of what we are thinking and feeling about these different topic areas. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll now. And I'm going to share the results. So we can see with our first question, a lot of people think of nighttime insect as the first thing that comes to mind when they think of moths. And second place goes to pollinator, and third place goes to butterfly lookalike as those options. And then we'll go down to how often do people notice moths outside? Top response was frequently, which is awesome. That's interesting. Second place was occasionally, third place rarely, and then the last one was never. So very interesting to hear. So thank you for participating in that. We're going to go ahead and move forward. So let's first explore Maryland's moth diversity. And this relates to the questions that we may have ourselves or we may get from people that we are working with, whether we are science communicators, teachers, and such. So how diverse are moths, and how many moth species are there, and what do they look like? There is a myth that floats around quite a bit about all moths being dull, drab, gray, brown, because those may be the ones that we typically encounter, maybe even inside our home, the ones that can be pests feeding on different textiles and such. But I'm happy to open up the world even further in terms of moth diversity, because there are a lot of really colorful and patterned moths out there, even here in the state of Maryland. So you may know the answer to this already if you read the description for today's webinar, but you're welcome to take a guess. You're welcome to put your guess in the chat if you'd like. But how many moth species do you think are here in Maryland? Can be an approximate amount, because even we still don't know exactly how many. We even have here on the bottom of the screen compared to, we have approximately 150 different butterfly species here in Maryland. So you took your guesses. So we have what we have described so far and have found and recorded is approximately 2,000 or more moth species here in Maryland. And that might be surprising to a lot of folks, right? Especially when we compare it to the number of butterfly species we have here. So we have many more moth species in Maryland compared to our butterflies. We're going to quickly walk through some key groups. This is just to give us some context and to give us some more visuals for what Maryland's moths can look like. And so this isn't for the sake of learning how to differentiate and ID these different groups. This is more as a kind of preview to Maryland's moth diversity to give us that background. But if you are interested in learning more about moth ID, there are a lot of really great resources out there. So we're going to be going through some key moth families. And so on the screen here on our right, we can see the taxonomic hierarchy, where at the very top, we start with kingdom, which is the broadest categorization that we have here of different life forms. And so we're narrowing down all the way to our family groupings. And on the left is the different families we'll go through, and their common names are shown there. We'll have the scientific family name shown at the top, as we'll see with our first group, commonly known as owlet moths. So this family is called Noctuidae or noctuid moths, and we can see some examples of the different owlet moth species that can be found here in Maryland. These are all going to be a very small collection of moths from this particular group, just to give you a little flavor, as you can say, for the moth diversity, different things that we can see. Our next group we'll talk about or look at is geometrids. For our family of Geometridae, you can see some of the species here on the screen. And even coming to mind, why do we think they have evolved to look this way? We may be able to start guessing where these moths typically like to rest or reside, maybe even having that camouflage, right, to blend in with different plant materials, whether it be bark, leaves, flowers. Our next group, one of our more charismatic groups of moths, are our giant silk moths, family of Saturnidae. So that includes things like our Luna moths, right, which are a prized moth to seed over the summertime. A lot of these moths are very large, And all of them have non-functional and reduced mouth parts, because a lot of them live for only a couple days or a very short period of time. So they're spending most of their lifetime, like a lot of our moths are, in that caterpillar stage. So it's very interesting. These moths, as adults, are not feeding. Our next group is known as our sphinx moths. It can also be commonly known as hummingbird moths because a lot of them can be quite large and get mistaken as hummingbirds in our gardens. They like to hover near tubular flowers. They have a very long proboscis to be able to access that nectar from these deep flowers. And we have our family of Sphingidae. They almost look like little airplanes with their wings. Some of their wings can even have translucent parts to them, known as clear wing moths. So a lot of cool things to look out for in the garden. Next group, some of our common names for this group is grass or snout moths, making them look like they have a snout coming from their face. Family of Carambidae. And so we have some of them up on the screen here. Some can have their wings open at rest. Some are a little bit more elongated, resting on sedges and grasses, so kind of along that leaf blade. And the last group we'll talk about, there are more moth families than this, but these are just some key ones that we're reviewing. Is this one that has multiple different common names. It includes underwings, tiger moths, tussock moths, and different allied related moths within this family of Erebidae. And so we have quite the diversity of patterns and colors here as well. So just a little preview into the diverse world of moths, particularly here in Maryland. And as I referenced earlier, a lot of these moths have evolved the way they look for particular reasons. We may not always know the reason, or we may guess what the reason is, right? Maybe it's for mimicking different things. Our moth on our left, some of our clear wing moths, like this Riley's clear wing moth, we can guess probably evolved to look this way to mimic different wasps or things that might scare or deter predators. We also have our two center moths, wavy lined emerald moth and our tulip tree beauty, that can easily blend into different plant textures, whether it be the venation on the bottom of a leaf or the rugged bark of a tree. And then we even have things that we assume to look like bird droppings. So we have a common name for this particular moth caterpillar called the exposed bird dropping moth. So not a very charismatic name, but we can see here, if we came across that in our garden, we may look over it, right, thinking that it is bird droppings in our garden on our plant. With our moths, they belong to a group known as Lepidoptera for the order. And this order includes moths and butterflies. They are very, very closely related. And both moths and butterflies that belong to this order, Lepidoptera, have complete metamorphosis. So they all have this general life cycle that has an egg stage, a larval stage, which we typically call caterpillars, a pupal stage, which could be a pupa, commonly known cocoon for a lot of our moths, or commonly known as a chrysalis for a lot of our butterflies. And then once they've completed that transformation, they will emerge as an adult, either a moth or a butterfly. And so just like we saw with our adult moths and the diversity of their morphology and how they can appear, the same thing can be said for all their different life stages. So just a few examples of what eggs can look like for our moths. Of course, there are more different color, shapes, sizes than this, but we can see an example of Luna moth eggs on our left. The center, we have some unknown noctuid eggs. Each of those little individual gray circles is an egg, so they lay quite a few eggs. It can be quite astonishing when we come across this on the bottom of a leaf or on a surface. And then some can be covered in hairs that protect them from the environment and predators, like this egg mass laid by our spongy moth. Caterpillars can be extremely diverse as well. And it is a completely different skill with caterpillar ID, especially because a lot of our caterpillars go through multiple caterpillar stages. So we think when a caterpillar first comes out of its egg, it's very small and can look quite different from a later stage caterpillar. Some species will change colors, will change the number of spines they have and such. And so it can be difficult to ID a caterpillar, especially some of those early stage smaller caterpillars. But just to show some examples, a lot of our giant silk moth caterpillars can get quite big, if not the size of a hot dog. There was one entomologist who actually took a picture of, I forget which silk moth it was, but he put the caterpillar in a hot dog bun just for the sake of showing folks how big they can be. The caterpillar wasn't injured. It was put right back onto the tree it came from. But quite large. Again, when I first came across a silk moth caterpillar, I could not believe how big it was. And you can even audibly hear its chewing sometimes if you're nearby. Some of our smaller caterpillars are really good at mimicking their environment. We have our wavy lined emerald caterpillar that can have plant parts and really blend in with the flowers that it's on. We have our beloved and well-known Isabel tiger moth caterpillar, woolly bears that a lot of people like to see. There's festivals around them. And then we even have caterpillars that we would not want to touch, right? They have irritating hairs or even stinging hairs like our saddleback caterpillar. Very cool to look at, but we want to leave them be. And then we have the cocoon or the pupal stage. Sometimes the moth is using different surrounding plant material to create their silken protective cocoon while they'll finish off their life cycle, like our Luna moth we can see on our left. And a lot of this pupa cocoon stage is going to be down in the soil or down in the leaf litter. So we'll return to this as we're talking about creating moth habitat. Leaf litter is very important for this group of animals, moths, and even our butterflies too. We can see an example sphinx moth pupa on the center of our screen, typically found down in the soil on the leaf litter as well. And then on our right, we can see some cocoons may be attached to plant material similar to butterfly chrysalises, could be interwoven within plant tissue, bringing in the different leaves so that they're more enclosed. So we can see what that polyphemus moth cocoon could look like within a particular leaf. So looking closely, sometimes these things are present and we don't see them. They might be down in the soil or down in the leaf litter, but sometimes when we're kind of looking at different leaves outside, we may come across this silken structure that could be a moth cocoon. So for fun, this photo was posted on iNaturalist, and are you able to spot where the moth cocoon is? I remember one time someone collected a moth cocoon and brought it in for me to see, and I could have sworn it was a tea bag. So sometimes they take on very interesting shapes and textures. We even put it in a growth chamber, mimicking outdoor conditions, reared out whatever was inside, and there was actually a lot of parasitic wasps that came out of this moth cocoon, which was really interesting. So if we've spotted it, it's right at the center there. But as you can imagine, if we're just kind of walking amongst the landscape, this can easily blend in with the different plant debris, the lawn. We may accidentally run over it with our lawnmower. We may accidentally step on it, but these things are there and present. Next, we're going to discover the roles moths play in our ecosystems. And so addressing some questions about why should we care about moths? And that lends to what roles do they play within our ecosystems? What are their ecosystem services, as we sometimes call it? Before we jump into this section, I'm going to launch a poll for here to get some input from you all. So it's just one question, which is what ecological roles do moths play in our ecosystems? And there are multiple options. Select all that apply. Pollination, nutrient cycling, natural pest control, food for wildlife. Okay, I'll go ahead and end the poll now. Share the results. See what others are thinking. So we see a lot of votes for pollination, food for wildlife. We're still getting votes for nutrient cycling, and natural pest control. Okay. And another discussion question we can kind of think about, I welcome any thoughts in the chat box. We're also going to return to this question after our section of ecological roles, which is, do you think it is useful or accurate to label insects as good or bad? So I get this question quite a bit, and a lot of you all likely get this question too, is when we're talking about a particular insect or insect species, they ask, is it a good or a bad insect? Or how do I identify the good insects in my garden? How do I identify the bad ones? So there's something to think about. We'll talk about three main roles that our moths can play within our ecosystems. One that makes sense and pertains to why we are having this webinar during National Pollinator Week is pollination. We'll talk about how they contribute to nutrient cycling as a food and nutrition source for a lot of our wildlife, including our birds. And then we'll have a little surprise fun one toward the end about another role that we may have picked up on from our little pre-question there. As we're talking about pollination, I'm just putting some numbers up on the screen to give us some context. Of course, a lot of these things are difficult to estimate because we need more research, we need more data, right? But based on the research we currently have, here are some interesting numbers to put up there. So approximately 75 to 95% of the world's flowering plants rely on pollinators to reproduce. So this includes cultivated and wild plants. Approximately 35% of the world's food crops rely on pollinators to reproduce. And what we'll see is in the background, we have images of different food crops. And I particularly included ones that we have some evidence of moths contributing to these particular food crops. So things like apples, avocados, blackberries, strawberries, peaches, and yucca. 25 to 50% of flower visits in agricultural ecosystems are by non-bee insect pollinators. So a lot of people will think of our bees as our super pollinators, which in a lot of situations they are. But as we do more and more research, more observations, we're starting to reveal more about the importance of other insect pollinators besides our bees, including our moths, where there was a research study done on the importance of moths for pollinating different apple flowers, so contributing to the fruit set of our apple trees. Now, moths, like many of our insects, can have very specialized relationships with plants, especially plants they've co-evolved with over a very long period of time. And so one interesting example of this is the primrose moth and its relationship with the common evening primrose or other primrose plants within this particular genus. And so we can see what the adult primrose moth looks like on our left, pink and yellow on top of this yellow common evening primrose flower. They like to roost in there during the day, and then at night they're typically active, feeding on nectar from night blooming flowers. Now on our right, we have an example of what their caterpillars can look like. There can be different color variations depending on which caterpillar stage they're at. We can see one example here. And the primrose moths pollinate the night blooming primrose flower, and the caterpillars exclusively feed, so they only feed on primrose plants within this primrose genus or group, and they're feeding on the flowers and the seeds. So it's this really interesting relationship, right, where the caterpillar, we would think hearing that's feeding on the flower and the seeds, might be considered a pest to some people, but it's also pollinating the plant as well. And this isn't a relationship that's only seen between this moth and this particular plant. We've seen this with other moth and plant species as well, where we have kind of this give and take relationship here, where we're helping to pollinate and produce more of this particular plant, the moths are, but then they're also using this plant as a host plant to produce more moths. And a lot of the times, because of this specialized relationship that's evolved over a long period of time, that the plant can tolerate this kind of this cost of giving away some of the petals, some of the seeds, for the benefit of being pollinated by this particular insect. So would we consider it a good or a bad insect? Now, a lot of people, as we saw at the start of our presentation, when they think of the word moth, they think of nighttime insect. And majority of our moths are nocturnal, they're night active pollinators, but we do have some day active moths as well. And there was a study that came out in 2017, and based on the data that they collected, we predict that approximately 15 to 25% of all butterfly and moth species are day active or diurnal. There are a few species that prefer kind of the in-between hours, dawn or dusk, crepuscular, as we say. And so we could see moths at any time of day. One classic example we can see with our repeating clip on our right is the white-lined sphinx moth. So the moth, that group that sometimes is mistaken for hummingbirds. I've seen them out during the day, active, feeding on different tubular flowers. Moths and their pollination can support plant genetic diversity, and this is extremely important in the age of climate change and different environmental stressors that our plants are facing. So the adult moths that have working and functional mouth parts are feeding on plant nectar along with other different sugary sources. It could be rotting fruit, it could be tree sap dripping from a tree. But as they're collecting plant nectar, as you can imagine, they have their hairy bodies. They're also picking up pollen and moving it between plants. So moving this genetic material around between plants within a plant community and across landscapes. And our moths, many of them can travel very long and far distances. So able to move that genetic material around. And this helps to support genetic diversity, which helps to boost the resiliency of our plant communities and populations, being able to lend for traits that hopefully allow them to adapt to different stressors that they could be facing. There was a study done in 2020 that found that moths can even be visiting flowers that bees skip or other daytime pollinators are skipping. So our night shift could be picking up some of the plants that weren't pollinated. They're pollinating them in the evening time. So this was done in agricultural fields in Norfolk County, UK from March to October in 2016 and 2017. And they were surveying different insect pollinators once a month, swabbing the insects, things like moths, bees, wasps, flies, and butterflies to different pollinator groups for pollen to determine which plants they had visited and how often. And based on these results, they found that 45.5% of moths surveyed were dusted with pollen from 47 different plant species. So that's quite a number of plants that they are visiting and moving pollen between. This included 7 plant species that daytime pollinators did not visit. So a very important role for them to come in and to be able to visit those flowers that our daytime pollinators did not get to. Next, we'll talk about nutrient cycling and how caterpillars can be a really important part of this. So caterpillars have nitrogen-rich excrement, which we call frass for our insects. And we may have come across this frass in our garden before, look like little pellets. They can vary in size depending on the stage and the size of the caterpillar. So as the caterpillar gets bigger, their frass pellets can get larger. So as we can imagine, like we're seeing with our orange striped oakworm caterpillar here, munching on some oak leaves, and as they're feeding, they're excreting out their frass. This frass will hopefully eventually make its way to the soil, and what happens from there. So we have this nitrogen-rich frass that they're excreting, but it is not in a form that is usable by plants. And so this is where the soil microbes and the fungi really come into play, and they're able to turn it into a form that is plant ready. And so being a part of our nitrogen cycle here, our caterpillars feeding, their frass dropping down, become a part of our soil community, those microbes breaking it down even further and releasing it into the soil as a form where plants can take it up as a form of nitrogen. And this is super important because a lot of our soil ecosystems do not have enough available nitrogen. And nitrogen tends to be one of the main nutrients that limits plant growth. So thanks to other insects that also have their frass as well, even the insect bodies that are decaying, this all supports our soil microbial community, our fungi, that will in turn provide nitrogen nutrients for our plants. And this process also supports our soil microbes to the point of it boosts their decomposition. So decomposition of other things that are dropping down onto our garden beds, our forest floors, so leaf litter, for instance, or other cadavers or decaying things. So helping that cleanup crew to have the energy, right, to be able to kind of decompose things even further, keeping things clean. Then we have caterpillars as a major food source for a lot of our wildlife, including our natural pest controllers, our parasitic wasps and flies. We'll explore it a little bit, the interesting story behind the tomato and tobacco hornworms, those white little pods we may have seen on them before. But there are a lot of wasps that will collect caterpillars to feed their young. More parasitic wasps on even different borers in our plants, other toads and reptiles, and a huge food source for our native birds. There's been a lot of research done, especially by Dr. Douglas Tallamy, on how our caterpillars support our bird populations, and going a step below from how that always starts with our native plant community, right? If we have our native plants, we support our native caterpillars, which supports our native birds. So both the adults and the caterpillars can be a food source for a lot of our wildlife. And approximately 96% of North American terrestrial birds feed or rear their young entirely or in part on insects. And it can take anywhere between 6,000 to 9,000 different caterpillars to raise one clutch of chickadees to the fledgling stage. So that's quite a few that we need out there in our landscapes to support chickadees and other birds as well. So if we've grown tomatoes before, we may have come across what a lot of people think of as a pest, right, that feeds on our tomatoes. It could be our tomato hornworm, or we're going to be specifically talking about our tobacco hornworm, a different species. And this particular caterpillar is a host for one of our parasitic wasps, our natural pest controllers. And we can see the size comparison here for how small this adult parasitic wasp is in comparison to a pencil and in comparison to the size of the caterpillar. So this parasitic wasp is flying throughout the landscape. It is a female. It is looking for its host, the tomato or tobacco hornworm, to lay its eggs in. And usually when we come across this particular moth caterpillar, we are seeing it feeding on our beloved tomatoes that we've spent so much time growing and putting love into so we can get some delicious tomatoes out of there. So the first thing the wasp does is lays its eggs on the tomato hornworm or tobacco hornworm, and these eggs will hatch. The larva of the wasp will be inside the caterpillar's body. It's going to feed on the innards of the caterpillar, mainly the hemolymph, which is the equivalent of blood for insects. Once they've reached a particular stage, they're going to begin to push their way out of the caterpillar skin, which seems quite gruesome, but cycle of life here. And we might have even seen this in our garden before, wondering what the heck is going on with this caterpillar. Now, these wasp larvae are going to begin to meticulously weave their own silken cocoon. So that is mainly what we've seen before, wondering if they were eggs, but this is actually the pupal stage of our parasitic wasp. Now, one of my coworkers was able to bring in one of these parasitized caterpillars, and we were actually able to capture some video underneath a microscope of these parasitic wasp larvae in action. So we can see here that is pushed out of the caterpillar skin. We see the mouth parts on the right side of the screen here, and it is meticulously weaving that silken cocoon. And this takes some time. And this is going to be its protective case, so it can complete its life cycle, become an adult wasp, and eventually emerge out. So once it is ready to emerge out, the adult wasp will chew a little hatch door on the top of that pupal case and then begin to push its way out, has its brand new wings, right? And is going to be released into the landscape, whether it's a male looking for females to reproduce or it's a female going out to find other hosts to lay her eggs in. So we have this interesting relationship, right, where a lot of us will see this caterpillar feeding on our plant and immediately think, oh, we have a pest, we need to get rid of it right away. But it may be a host for our natural pest controllers or beneficial parasitic wasps. And beyond that, what does this caterpillar turn into? It turns into an adult moth, known as the Carolina sphinx moth. So we have kind of two different common names that we denote to the caterpillar stage versus the adult stage. So we can see, particularly with our tobacco hornworm, turns into the moth we can see on the right side of our screen. Quite a large moth with a wingspan of approximately 5 inches. Now, this moth helps to pollinate a lot of our night blooming plants. So that can include things with like phlox or common evening primrose. So another situation, whether do we think of this species as a pest or beneficial when it comes to our tobacco hornworm? Is it context dependent? What should we do if we find a parasitized hornworm in our garden? Do we leave it be to allow those parasitic wasps to emerge? Or even if we have a hornworm in our garden that isn't parasitized, do we have some plants we might be able to sacrifice to be able to reduce some of these pollinating moths? So all questions to really think about. Now we talked about these 3 key roles, but we have another one that I recently learned about. Now I knew there were some moth caterpillars or butterfly caterpillars, I think in Hawaii, that have been found as predatory. But I didn't know we had something local where we have moths that are actually contributing to pest control services. So a lot of folks don't like our paper wasps, right? Because they tend to create these paper nests above our doors and around our buildings that we frequent. And they can be defensive of their nests and sting if they feel threatened or if their nest feels threatened. Now, what I recently learned is about this moth in Maryland and in our area called the sooty wing calceotia. I think if I'm probably butchering that last part of it, but we can see what the adult moth looks like here on our right. Quite pretty to look at. You can see the size comparison to a quarter. So a little bit of a smaller moth, because what this moth does at night is it finds a paper wasp nest and it will lay its eggs in this nest. Now the caterpillars will come out and they'll feed on the immature stage of the wasps. And from there, the caterpillars will weave their own cocoons, and this is where they will spend the winter time. So a lot of our wasps are dying off as it gets cold in the wintertime beyond the queens. But the moths are still going to be there. So if we have a paper wasp nest that we find in late fall or winter, if we know that the wasp activity is gone, they've died off, it could be really cool to take it down, look to see if we may see some signs of this parasitic caterpillar, because we want to keep that around so that we can allow these caterpillars to pupate and become their adult moths, which is really interesting. So coming back to our discussion question of, do you think it is useful or accurate, two different things here, to label insects as good or bad? Is it context dependent? Is it typically always in the gray area? And it can be, is it helpful, right? As we're teaching folks about insects, it can be helpful in terms of a quick good or bad labeling, right? But as we'll explore insect stories more and more, we learn more about their relationships with plants and other wildlife. It's a bit more complex than the simple labeling of good or bad. Next, we're going to learn ways to support moth habitat. And I have a quick poll question for you in regards to this. So we have just one question here. Which of these do you already have in your landscape? Select all that apply. So it includes things like native plants, grasses or sedges, night blooming flowers, leaf litter, reduced or no chemical use. So it includes things like pesticides and herbicides, or none of the above, which is okay too. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, share those results. So it looks like we already have a lot of moth habitat within our own green spaces, with native plants being very popular and reduced or no chemical use coming in a close second, leaf litter coming in a close third. So how can we conserve moths? And we'll have three main sections here when it comes to creating habitat, reducing hazards, and then observing moths. So part of that conservation rate is learning more about them. So we can learn more about their host plants, their different habitat needs. And that can be as easy as snapping a photo of a moth or even a moth on a particular plant. Returning back to our general life cycle for both moths and butterflies, and I always like to bring this to folks' attention when we're talking about creating habitat not only for our moths, but also our pollinators. Because when we're supporting our pollinators, we should not only be aiming to support the adult stage by providing nectar, but also thinking about all the other life stages. What do they need as a caterpillar or an immature stage, a larval stage? What are they feeding on? Where are they pupating? What is their transformation like? Are they in the leaf litter, in the soil? Are they spending the winter months there? Because if we are only supporting the adults, we may not even be able to get to that adult stage, right? If we're not also supporting the caterpillar and the pupal stage as well. And this all centers around our native plant community and what plant material that we can have in the landscape for all of these different life stages. And so we have our different petals of our flower here to support creating a moth haven, incorporating a diversity of native plants, leaving the leaves where we can, reducing hazards like light pollution and bug zappers, and then last but not least, reducing that chemical use, whether it be herbicides or pesticides. And so native plants, this is becoming a bigger and bigger message and movement. Some folks have asked us, why are we talking about native plants so much? But it's really important because a lot of, especially our urbanized spaces, still lack native plants and native plant diversity. And a lot of research is supporting, right? Our native plants support our native wildlife. So if we want to support native pollinators, we need our native plants present. And with our wide diversity of pollinators and moths, as we're talking about today, they have a diversity of needs. And so to be able to meet those needs, we need a diversity of different plants because they all serve different roles and functions for these different insects. Now, there are particular native plants which we label as keystone native plant species or groups that are especially important because they've been shown to support a high number of different wildlife species. And so these include our oaks and our maples and our willows, and this is shown to be the case particularly for our butterfly and moth communities as well. And so one study that came out in 2020 found that approximately 14% of our plant species support about 90% of our moth and butterfly communities. So we have a small selection of plants that we can call kind of our heavy hitters, the ones that are especially important in supporting a lot of different caterpillars, for instance. And so on our right is some of the top plant groups or plant genera that they found to be the most supportive to our moth and butterfly caterpillars. So things like our oaks, willows, cherries, plums, peaches that belong to our genera Prunus, pines, and then poplars, aspens, and cottonwoods that belong to Populus. So if we're thinking about adding a new native tree or people are asking for recommendations, these are some good groups to look at as keystone species. Now, beyond our keystone groups, those can be really important, but we also want to think about diversity because we have some of our pollinator species or moth species that are specialists. So they rely on a small group of plants or even just one particular plant species. And if that isn't out there in the landscape, they aren't going to be supported. So that goes beyond our tree groups as we just saw. And we're talking about diversity, we're talking about species and structural diversity. So increasing number of species we have. Always keep in mind we want at least a good rule of thumb is 3 or 4 individuals from that same species planted together in a group. But thinking beyond our wildflowers, right? When people think pollinators, they think of flowers, which are really important, but also thinking about caterpillar food. We need foliage. Some of our caterpillars rely on feeding on our grasses and sedges, our native grasses and sedges, shrubs and vines and trees. And to reiterate again, to not forget our native grasses and sedges, because there are particular moth and butterfly caterpillar species that they only feed on particular native grasses and sedges in our area. We can incorporating night blooming plants for our nocturnal pollinators and planting for our specialists. So here's an example of a particular moth species found here in Maryland. It is listed on our endangered, rare, and threatened Maryland species list. It is commonly known as Newman's brocade moth, and its caterpillar primarily feeds on tall perennial grasses, such as our big blue stem. So we need those grasses and sedges there to support moths like this. An example of a native evening blooming flower, a common evening primrose. And then we're talking about specialists, we're talking about caterpillars that, again, feed on a small group of plants or even just down to they rely on one plant species versus our generalists. So caterpillars that can feed on a very wide range of plants. So a great example of this is our Virginia tiger moth caterpillar, which feeds on a wide range of herbaceous and woody plants in their foliage versus our primrose moth caterpillar, as we saw earlier, which only feeds on primrose plant foliage, so that belongs to that primrose genus. And so keeping this in mind, we have our keystone plants that we can plant that support a lot of different caterpillars, particularly a lot of our generalists, maybe some of our oak specialists, maple specialists, and so on. But going a step further, if we're in that journey of our pollinator habitat creation rate, and exploring the different moth species in our area. So we call this profiling, where we learn about different species and their host plants, and some might be very narrow. And so with this, to get us started, I have 5 different moth species here in Maryland that are in some way or form a specialist. So rely on a small group down to even just one plant species. And so we can intentionally plant these particular host plants if they are great for our particular ecoregion or area, right? Making sure the right plant, right place. And so things like milkweed plants to support milkweed tussock moth, tulip poplar trees to support our tulip tree silk moth, grape plants, so wild and cultivated for our Pandora sphinx moth, lowbush blueberry, which we think supports our pink sallow moth, which is also on that rare, endangered, threatened list for Maryland. This is an unknown, so something to explore. We're able to have a good space for our lowbush blueberry, observe it, maybe we'll spot the caterpillar and be able to confirm that that's its host plant. And then we have seaside goldenrod borer moth, which exclusively feeds on seaside goldenrod. So if we are in the kind of coastal areas that can support this particular goldenrod species, a great one to plant for this particular moth. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the moths in your area, do your own profiling to learn about moths and their host plants, I highly recommend going on to iNaturalist. They have a lot of really cool filtering features. And so this particular short link that I have up on the screen, go.umd.edu/moths near me, will lead you to this filter that excludes our superfamily of butterflies. So we'll show a lot of our moth species. And with that, we can filter by location. So cool thing is we can filter broadly for Maryland. We can click on the tab of species and it will list and rank species. So our top observed moth species in Maryland is the Isabella tiger moth. And what's cool about this is what I did is actually scrolled all the way down to the bottom to the least observed moths, because that tells me these are ones that we still need observations for. Maybe we need more host plants for in our area. If we want to get more specific to us, we can type in our city as well to see even more kind of localized observations. So something cool to explore. And once we have a particular species we want to learn more about, we can click on it, get to its about page, and it will have some resources listed. And you can also explore some outside resources as well. What you may be surprised to learn is that there are a lot of unknowns for some of these species. Sometimes we don't know what particular plants it feeds on or how many different types of plants it feeds on. So it's a call to action where we need to know more, observe more, and it can be as easy as taking a photo. Next, we'll talk about leaving the leaves. More and more research has shown the importance of leaf litter for our insect and wildlife communities. Many moths, including butterflies, spend one of their life stages down in the leaf litter. A lot of the time it's going to be during the colder months, but as we'll see that this leaf litter can serve as habitat through all the different seasons. And so a lot of people will ask, what is the date on the calendar I can point to and be like, okay, I can clean up this leaf litter, I can get rid of it, and I'm okay in terms of the insects have emerged. But as this research showed by Ferlato and Burkhart in 2025, was there wasn't a peak time in emergence that they found for the spring and summer months, because insects are emerging at all different times. They have different phenologies. So it's actually best if we can to always keep the leaf litter out there in certain areas. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. But this particular study had some really interesting results, one of which was removing leaves reduced the number of butterfly and moth species by 45% in these managed landscapes. So if we're removing that leaf litter, we're removing the moth and butterfly species along with other insects and invertebrates. They documented over 100 species of moths and butterflies using yards as overwintering habitat. So if you think your yard isn't being used as winter habitat, it is. It isn't just the woods and the natural areas, but your space as well, no matter if you have a pollinator garden or not. And so I've been working with Max Ferlato, who is the lead author on that paper. We're hoping to put together a fact sheet, some resources and guidelines for different ways that we can manage our leaf litter, right? Because it may not be feasible for us to leave the leaf litter in all areas of our landscape. We may be dealing with different HOA policies that requires us to remove it from the front of our yards, for instance. So we're hoping to come out with a guide to give you some options. But again, every square inch space counts where we can leave the leaf litter. Can be tricky with wind as well. But some key places are under our native plants, especially under our tree canopies where it naturally falls to the ground. There are some more and more movements, especially through the Xerces Society, about leaving the leaves. And so there are different ways we can put up signage, particularly educational signage, to let our neighbors know that leaving the leaves is intentional. It's habitat. There's some awesome local artists I've seen in Baltimore, especially creating their own signs with the different animals that use leaf litter as that habitat. Reducing our chemical use. Fire poles, it looks like a lot of us are doing this already, if not eliminating chemical use. So it includes things like herbicides, because a lot of our moth species actually use what we deem are more weedy weed plant species in our yard as host plants. And so if we're using widespread herbicides, we're likely killing off a lot of their host plants as well. Pesticides, same deal. This is a common time of year where folks are getting approached by different pest control companies. My parents got a flyer in the mail with services for controlling spiders along with other pests. And I'm like, what do we have against spiders? They're beneficial arthropods. And so there's a lot of messaging going on out there that it's a quick fix. We'll spray your yard, we'll get rid of all the pests. But a lot of those active ingredients that are being used not only harm our pests, arthropods, but also our beneficial ones as well. So being mindful of this. And a lot of these cases, especially mosquito sprays, it's a very temporary solution, not a long-term sustainable one. And again, you could be negatively impacting the beneficials, not only in your yard, but also your neighbor's yard, as we're seeing with more and more research. Coming up to reducing and avoiding hazards. I like to talk about this one because light pollution is usually known, right? We know that this can be distracting to moths. It can also tire them out. It can lead to them being attracted to a particular spot and be a hot spot for predators to know where they are, right? They're an easy picking. They're in one area, and so they could be taken out by a predator a little bit more easily. It distracts them, it tires them out from doing other functions such as mating or pollinating, all the different ecosystem services that we like from them. And even just from my porch light at night, we're not only seeing moths, but we're seeing lots of different insects. There are a lot of insects that can be active at night. I've seen ladybird beetles, ladybugs out at lamps at night, green lacewings. So a lot of our beneficials that we are causing harm to by keeping that light on at night. Now, of course, being mindful of our safety needs. We do want lit pathways for areas for accessibility purposes, right? But if we're able to, and if it makes sense for our situation, we can opt in for motion activated lighting, timed lighting to have them on at certain times, or dim lights that are low to the ground are some suggestions. Bug zappers. So I have seen these in neighborhoods before and they break my heart. It like pains me every time I hear a little spark go off because these things are zapping any different insect that is out there. The research has shown that they are not effective at reducing pest biting insects and controlling them. You're basically just creating a beacon for any nocturnal insect to come to the light and get electrocuted. And they've shown when they've done survey results on these electric outdoor zappers that they're mainly killing moths and beetles. So a lot of our beneficial pollinators at night. Sticky traps and sticky tree bands are also not specific. So a lot of folks will put them up, especially for the invasive spotted lanternfly, but being mindful that these don't only trap our pest insects, but also any sort of flying insect, along with, unfortunately, birds and other animals. There have been many reports, especially through Maryland Department of Agriculture, of birds getting trapped to the point of dying on these sticky traps. We may not think they're that strong, but they can be. So we do not recommend using these sticky bands or traps in outdoor settings, particularly without some sort of mesh around the top of it. But even then, we're still trapping smaller insects that might not be pests. Now, these sticky traps are typically used for monitoring purposes to know if we have a pest in an area, not for pest control. So not recommended. And unfortunately, this is some images of what can happen of an electric trap. We can see closely, we have a lot of different moths on this trap that have been killed by the electric bug zapper. And then unfortunately, along with our bird shown on our right. Okay, we've learned different ways to create habitat to reduce those hazards. So we already have that habitat right, but unfortunately, we don't know any better. We put out an electric trap. We might just be killing the moths that we're attracting to our landscape. So it has to include both creating that habitat and reducing the hazards as well. Next, we're going to be talking about how to observe moths and contribute data. And to take a little pause, brain break, we'll have a poll question for you now. Great time to get up and stretch if you want to right here. Oh, and just to read aloud our two questions for folks that might not be able to see the poll. First one is, have you ever intentionally observed moths at night? And the second question is, have you ever contributed observations to participatory science platforms? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end our poll, share those results. So we can see our top answer for our first question, have you ever intentionally observed moths at night, is a few times. Never comes in second place. Third place, yes, regularly. So we have some newcomers, great news. We'll talk about observing moths, especially at night, which is great. Second question, have you ever contributed observations to participatory science platforms? Top question is no. Second answer is yes. And then we have a few unsure. So thank you for participating in that. Some interesting results. So newcomers to participatory science and moth observation. Great news. Okay, we'll go ahead and move forward. And we're going to be talking about National Moth Week, if we haven't heard about this before. So Moth Week is going to be coming up July 18th through the 26th for the year of 2026. So it's always going to be a week in July. It's founded in 2012. There are over 90 participating countries. They say 50 years of knowledge with 10 published journals. And it started as a local mothing event through Friends of the East Brunswick Environmental Commission, which was a nonprofit, and it has grown and expanded this movement of mothing. And if we've never heard of mothing before, it is intentionally observing moths, particularly in the evening time, where a lot of the time we're putting up some form of artificial light. We're intentionally attracting moths to an area so that we can observe them, snap photos, and collect data about them. So it's easy. It's as easy as having a light source and then taking photos and posting them to different participatory science platforms such as Project NOAA or iNaturalist. And so here are some examples of mothing that I did last summer with friends and family. We did it in a very small backyard. You don't even need a sheet if you have kind of the side of your house, a shed or a building that's light colored. Good to kind of see the contrast between the moths, and then some form of a light. Could be a porch light, it could be a blue light that you set up, could be mercury vapor if you want to get fancy with it. On our right, We have a field near my parents' house with power lines. And so we thought to go out there because there is a patch of woods that lines up to this field, and we kind of set up there to see what we could observe. You could do this at all different hours of night. You're going to see different moths at different hours of the evening time. I will say, typically you're going to see a lot more, going to depend on the area you're in, time of year, of course. In the summertime, the later in the evening. So say midnight or later in the wee hours. And so some mothers will camp out. They'll be out there till midnight. They'll take a quick nap and then even get up at, say, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., because you're going to be seeing different moths that are active. There are other cool tools to have. A fun one is a black light flashlight. And so this could be a way of you not necessarily setting up a sheet or a light, like a mass beacon for moths, but maybe you're just exploring your own garden in the evening time. Could be a quick thing because a lot of moths and caterpillars will glow under the UV light, like we can see with our example caterpillar on our right. So this could be a cool way to spot some nocturnal insect activity, some things you may not see in your garden during the day. If we do want to hang up some sort of sheet, we can use any sort of light colored sheet. The plainer, the better. If we have patterns on it, it's going to be hard to kind of photograph and see those moths, but we can make whatever we have work. And then with the lights, again, it can be any sort of light. There are lots of resources out there if we want to get fancy with our light setups. Different lights are going to be attracting different types of moths typically. So between black lights, mercury vapor, I've got a lot of black lights that I'll set up on different light stands and point at a sheet, and that has worked pretty well. We can also put together moth baits. So a lot of resources online for that as well. Could be fermenting some fruit and painting it onto tree bark that will attract certain moths and other different baits that have been put together as well. And just some mothing fun. I think this is a great way to bring in some friends, some family, some neighbors, bringing together different master gardeners from our group. You do not need to be an expert. As you can see, we have thousands of moth species. So even if you invited me out there, I would not be able to identify everything on that sheet. But it's a cool way to explore, to get curious about moth diversity, to get others curious about moths. And that can snowball right into wanting to learn about their host plants, maybe adding those host plants to our landscapes to be able to better conserve our biodiversity. We can include snacks. Last year here at the Central Maryland Research and Education Center, we hosted our own mothing event. We had someone made mocktails that were themed around the rosy maple moth. So you can have some pre-activities, could be educational with a pre-talk, could be food and fun, and then leading off into the evening hours. I recommend getting your setup up in the daylight so you have more light to work with, and then you can go out to your setup in the evening time. The tricky part is taking everything back down. And so I'll come to that in a second, but just to show some examples of some moths that we saw mothing last summer. It can be helpful to have a separate light source to have behind you, or your whether you're using your phone or if you have a camera with a flash, lighting can be important. So you may need a helper to kind of hold the flashlight so you can take a clear photo of the moth. So the key piece here is the takedown. So you want to remember to turn the lights off if we've turned on some lights in the area when we are done, because we do not want to create a smorgasbord trap, ecological trap for birds, bats to come in and eat all the moths on the sheet. And so one tactic, if you have your own tips that works best for you, I'd love to hear them, but I think it's tricky to get the moths off of a sheet or a surface that we've attracted them to, even once we've turned the lights off. And so one tactic that I've taken is I've turned the lights off, but I've left the sheet up for the night, and then I'll see that some moths have left once we reach the daytime hours the next day. I'm able to kind of shake off the remainder. If we want to take down the sheet that night, turn off your lights, and then with a friend, shake the sheet as much as you can and gently shoo away the moths and other nocturnal insects that you'll attract as well. This is tricky. They like to hang on and cling on, but as best we can, we want to make sure that we're not harming them and we're encouraging them on their way. The National Moth Week website has a lot of really great resources. They have some tips on if we want to create baits, lights, the sheet setup as well. And they also have an events page every year. And so this is a cool way to show that people are participating in National Moth Week, that we're doing our own mothing nights, whether it be a private event with friends and family or a public event. And so I encourage you to think about maybe having your own mothing night, could even just be with yourself, and registering it or just kind of denoting it that this happened, because currently we don't have any, as we can see by this map that I screenshot yesterday, any public or private events planned for Maryland. So we want to represent, right? We want to show that we are participatory scientists, that we're curious and excited about moths. So go to this website link, plan out your event. Doesn't have to be fancy, so we can get some mothing on that map. Okie dokie. So the last section we're going to be talking about is outreach around moths and then broadly pollinators. We're already in National Pollinator Week. Some of us have already held Pollinator Week events, which is great. We may have some coming up over the summer, or some events where we can incorporate information about moths and pollinators into. We're going to consider ways to inspire curiosity and care for moths and others. And we'll have a question for you. One question about moth outreach, which is, who are you most likely to share information about moths with? Select all that apply. We have our options of friends and family, general public members, gardening groups, community organizations, students or youth, coworkers, and other. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end our poll here. So our top answer was family and friends. Very awesome. Second top answer was gardening groups. And then third, it's a close tie-ish between general public members and student or youth groups. So awesome to see. Very cool. Thank you for sharing. Okay, coming to our question of how can we teach others about moths? I'm a strong believer in starting with sparking that curiosity around something that could eventually lead to care, to action, conservation, and environmental action. But that's where my own personal story stems from. I didn't always love insects. It wasn't until college, until I took a college course that was required for my major, that really changed my whole mind around the world of insects. And it was all from really passionate educators, engaging activities that sparked my curiosity, my passion to want to do the same thing for others, to empower others with the knowledge and opening up this whole world, diverse world of insects and moths, as we're talking about today. So I know we have some passionate, empowering educators in our virtual Zoom room today and maybe watching our recording. And so I want to be able to support you all as best as I can. I know some of you have some very unique and engaging ideas when it comes to outreach and education, particularly around our pollinators. And so one toolkit I have been kind of evolving over the past year or so is the Maryland Pollinator Week toolkit. And so some newer features is it has a clickable table of contents now. And it is a digital toolkit with key pollinator information, activities, handouts, and resource links and more to support your own outreach and education when it comes to pollinators. And so that can be found on the through the QR code shown on the bottom right or through the short link of go.umd.edu/pollinator toolkit. And this is meant to be used digitally. To click through, it will link you to different printable handouts, activities, and such. And I'm always looking for collaborators. So if you have your own activity handout guide that you really like to use, I'd love to include it in the next version of the toolkit. One thing that I like to highlight is our pollinator flashcards. I'm hoping to add to this. We currently have 8 different cards. They can be printed separately or front to back, with the front showing an image of the pollinator, the back having some information related to their diet, nesting, flower preferences, winter location, and so on, featuring a native host plant as well. So this could be a fun matching game to have people try to match up the back to the front, or it can be kind of a quick look where they could flip the card over for kind of adult and teen audiences. There's also a feature, we can see that if we find this in the toolkit or through the short link shown on the screen, this is in the written directions on one of the first pages, is there is color coding to show generalist versus a specialist pollinator if we want to incorporate that into our outreach and our kind of discussions and conversations that we have. Lots of really great youth activities out there. One that I took inspiration from a lot of folks online is different ways to mimic pollination for kids to play with. There are different materials that are used. I like to use crushed up chalk. You can get yellow chalk. I've used all different types of colors and sorted them off on different flowers. And then that kind of mixture of colors that they can visibly see, we can kind of visibly see that cross-pollination, which can be cool. People have used crushed up food material. We just want to be careful with food allergies with this. But chalk can work pretty well, can get a little messy. And then having some pollinators for them to use. I've done it one way, which we can see on our right, with the kids make their own pollinators with popsicle sticks, pipe cleaners, something fuzzy so the chalk can get on there, or the fake pollen. And I've also had it as a quick tabling activity where I already have some laminated insect pollinators. We could make moth ones from moth photos, and then I would cut and insert some pipe cleaner legs so that could pick up the chalk as well. So that's linked there, short link / youth pollination activity. Instructions and printouts are included. We also have some quick handouts, great for tabling as well, catches people's eye. I found that when I've done tabling, people do stop and want to look at these. Just some examples of different fly, moth, and beetle pollinators that can be found in Maryland. And then a new one that I added last night is this activity that I tested out last summer. We held a insect palooza event in Howard County at the Harriet Tubman Cultural Center. Had a really cool turnout. And one thing that I found with mothing is you can do it at all different hours in the evening. So we can do it early evening to include some of our younger participants and families. But sadly, we don't always see the really cool moths in the early hours of the night. So I wanted to make mothing more accessible, to bring some of the cool moths to people at any hour of the day. So what we tested out, we had this set up indoors, but this could also be done outdoors. I had my mothing frame, sheet, black lights. We were in a room where we turned off the lights. We had our black lights going to mimic the outdoor evening mothing setup. I had a speaker playing katydid noises to really set the scene. And then a part of this activity that's now through the short link or in the toolkit link too, is to have printouts where on one side of the sheet, I have the shadows, the black kind of images of the different nocturnal insects. So when folks walk in, they're given a handout showing these shadows too, and I have people try to guess what insects they're looking at. And then if they walked around to the other side of the sheet, I have same insect cutouts, same size, but full color versions. And then that handout they have, they'll flip around backside and we'll have the common name, scientific name, so people can learn more. And so there are lots of different ways you could probably set this up. If we don't have a sheet and a frame, we could set these up on a wall. We can get creative with it. But I really enjoyed having those katydid sounds playing too to make it a little bit more immersive. And so this is the front and back handout that's included as a printout. I like to have a couple of these copies laminated, and then I'll just kind of lend them to participants who want to actively look at the display and collect them back for new participants coming in. There are also a number of other handouts I've included with the document that has all the printouts that you can choose from, such as profiles on the different nocturnal insects that are part of the display. So if people want to learn more, right? What plants do they need? What roles do they play? That's all included to kind of have not only the nocturnal insect mothing set up, but also some educational kind of tabling handouts that can be displayed as well. So if you have an event coming up this will work, I'd love for you all to try it out, have your own setup, snap photos, email them to me. I would love to see this in action. I'd love some feedback as well too. Another thing that I have coming up that I will have in time for National Moth Week, and I can be sure to email it out to you all too. It will be linked in the Pollinator Toolkit. It's going to be a silhouette key to major moth families. And so I come across someone who had created these moth silhouettes. And this can be a quick kind of intro way to moth identification to get them to different families and groups. So this could be really fun to have for your own mothing events, to pair with that nocturnal insect displays I just saw, to have people kind of guess between different moths. We'll end off with some additional resources and books. I own the first two. I think if we are really interested in getting into the weeds of moth ID, the different species, especially if we're going to be mothing, taking photos, I really like to use this Peterson Field Guide to Moths of Northeastern North America. Widely used book by a lot of moths enthusiasts. If we're interested in caterpillars, Caterpillars of Eastern North America is a really great book. And then I recently learned about this one, Gardening for Moths, a regional guide. It sounds very cool. I heard a podcast with one of the authors, Jim McCormick. He also has a really interesting blog with a lot of moth pictures. But just to note that this guide was created for Midwestern gardeners. Jim is located in Ohio. So it may not be completely relevant to Maryland, but could be an interesting book if you're curious or if you know of Midwestern gardeners and need a gift idea. And then if we haven't heard already of our Maryland Native Plants program, our regional guides, we have our Piedmont guide for the Piedmont region in Maryland is out now. Coming soon is the Coastal Plain Guide. So these are really great resources to learn more about plants that are appropriate for our region of Maryland, and then narrowing it down to kind of site conditions too, if they meet the sun and the water conditions that we have. So getting some ideas for our own gardens. And there are some great articles in there for more specifics for gardening for birds or gardening for beneficial insects. And the short link is there that will lead to all the really great Maryland native plant resources. With that, we've come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you for sticking around till now. I'm putting up again our University of Maryland Assurance and Non-Discrimination Statement, as well as our Injustice for All posters. And with our remaining about 5 minutes here, we're at 1:25. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yay! Thanks, Maddie. So many kudos in the chat. This is just such an awesome info-packed presentation. We really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise with us today. Okay, so I think you've already answered the first two. So we're the only question we have right now. And if anyone has a question, go ahead and put it in now before we sign off. So the question is, and you talked about this a little bit, but do you have a reference on how to set up a moth watching station, like with the white sheet and the lights and everything?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm still kind of testing out different setups myself. I'm fairly new to mothing over the past year. And before I answer this, I did just launch our final poll. So before you leave, if you could answer one more question, that'd be great. But yes, for some tips, I think it would be kind of scoping out your area that you'd want to do moth observation in. It can be your
Mm-hmm.
backyard. I've done it in suburban backyards and saw a lot of diversity. So you don't have to go to some remote location where you're in the middle of a field or in the middle of the woods. So whatever makes sense to you, especially if you're bringing your own light source, because if you don't have like a generator or a really large battery pack to power your light source,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be tricky. You can get battery powered black lights. I have a couple of those that I will actually binder clip to my sheet frame setup. So that can be kind of a workaround if we don't have a power source. But extension cords can work well, especially if we're kind of just in our backyard. But starting small, finding some sort of sheet could be something around the house. We don't mind getting a little dirty. We can throw in the wash later. Um, Using binder clips if we want, hooking it up. If we want to get fancier, purchasing some sort of frame, and then different light sources that we can explore. Black lights, black light flashlights, a cool thing to start with. And then looking at resources if you want to get into that more mercury vapor lights. Being safe around it, we want to be careful and mindful with kids that we don't look into these lights. Some of them can be quite powerful.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We did it, like Maddie mentioned, at Simrec for the first time last summer, and it was so much fun. And even if you don't have like the most wildly successful moth covered sheet, it's still really fun to get out and explore our natural environment at night in a way that a lot of us don't see it as often. And we had kiddos at our event and they just loved it. They thought it was great. So experimenting and testing it out, honestly, like, I've seen Maddie, that's what she's doing too. So we can just all figure it out together, but don't let it stop you from trying just because you don't feel like you have all the specifics exactly figured out.
Right. No, exactly. And forewarning folks too, if we have some kind of insect nervous people that are coming, that we want them to stay
Mhm.
away from the light sources because they can get quite swarmed with different nocturnal insect activity. One way to kind of work with this is to get them like a head net. So if they kind of feel a little iffy about things crawling on them, around them, this can be helpful too.
Great tip. Um, and we had another person who was asking if the repellent for deer, like the liquid ones that folks are applying to stuff, are those also having an impact on our pollinators?
Good question. I don't know specifically for that deer repellent. I would have to look at a particular product and look at the different ingredients it has, particularly that active ingredient, which could have kind of that pesticidal effect sometimes. I think any sort of input that we're adding to our landscapes, right? Even things that we deem kind of low impact, like neem oil or insecticidal soap, can have an
Hmm.
impact on wildlife. So just being mindful of that. There's kind of decisions that need to be made, pros and cons weighed. So I'd say any sort of like chemical solution that we're applying, even if it's geared toward deer, could have
Yep.
some sort of impact on insects. We may not even know what that impact is.
Hmm.
So just things to be mindful of.
Yep, that makes sense. And just in case folks did miss the answer earlier, because there were a lot of thumbs up and folks have missed some other questions, do you have any suggestions of Maryland native night blooming plants?
Oh, yeah. I think it is tricky to find some Maryland native ones. I think the common evening primrose is a good go-to, along with phlox, which are like blooming really early spring, really pretty. But I
Mhm.
think those two are good. If anyone has any other suggestions, I'd love to hear them in the chat. There are a lot of
Yeah,
non-natives that can be great evening blooming plants, but those are some of the kind of more common native ones, I would say.
yeah, absolutely. I know Annette is on with us today, and Annette does a really fantastic evening gardening lecture. So, Annette, if you have anything to add, feel free. Okay, so with that, Maddie, you're just getting tons of thanks, tons of kudos in the chat. Also, for folks who are looking for links, if you want to go to the chat, you can find the link for the pollinator toolkit, which I put in the chat, and I also put the link for the Maryland Native Plant Guide in the chat as well, so you can grab those before you leave if you'd like to have them today. So with that, thank you everyone for joining. It was really fun. And Maddie, thank you for sharing all of this. What a fun topic. I think we're all super amped up and excited about moths now. So thank you for the inspiration today. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all. Have a good week. Happy National Pollinator Week.
Yay.